the young educated audience who are listening to this, or the students in the classes, or those who are in universities, they have a larger role to play because they would be the next generation of policymakers. If you look at United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's a very broad agreement with the parameters of debate discussed. And it also acknowledges the diversity of the world. So, what are the experts saying regarding or despite everything that goes on? Some people declare it as a success, some people declare it as a failure. What IPCC does is it provides knowledge to governments, shares knowledge with government on the state of research on climate change.
Hello dear aspirants, I am Vishal Salsekar and I welcome you all for this special educational video regarding international relations. We all know that climate change is a very important aspect, and as far as the international relations are concerned, it is going to create a lot of issues with respect to a lot of countries. So to discuss more about the climate change related aspects and to discuss the developments that the countries are doing regarding this, I am joined by Anjani Sir, who is the faculty of Vision IAS. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Vishal.
So, sir, when we talk about climate change, there are a lot of concerns that we are seeing and the conflict that the countries are facing with respect to each other. So, can you briefly elaborate about the impact of climate change on the countries?
So, Vishal, we have to understand that environment as an issue has been a latecomer to international negotiations. It has not prominently featured in bilateral relations, which is the primary mode through which countries engage. And at the multilateral level, the recognition that we need to deal with climate change as a global crisis is a later day development, which started with 1992. So currently, countries in terms of their social systems, their economic systems, have to figure in the impacts of climate change into their policy making. For example, we in India, with a country of 1.4 billion people, have goals like poverty elevation, faster levels of growth. Now, these issues are inextricably linked with what is happening in the context of our climate system. So, for example, the amount of energy that goes into building our economy or through the manufacturing process has an outcome in terms of emissions, and these emissions have been recognized as a source of climate change, and the pace of climate change is picking up. Now, in terms of implications of climate change, we see that, let's say, India as a country is a diverse country. So, in different regions, there are different impact of it. For example, if we see the arid regions in our country, climate change would exacerbate something like desertification. If we see the countries which are rain fed, so rains would become more erratic, extreme, and there would be variation in seasonal patterns. So, as we traditionally understand that we are a monsoon dependent economy,
Right.
the way global climate changes would have far reaching implications, not only in terms of our economic outcomes, but also the social outcomes that we see. And if our goal is to become developed or Viksit Bharat by 2049, an added aspect to that is how do we do it while contributing to arresting the climate change and its adverse implications.
Exactly. And also when it comes to the international relation, like managing relation between the countries, I think there also the climate as a factor becomes a very important.
Since climate is changing for everyone,
Right.
in the relations between two countries,
Right.
in different contexts, it would be an issue.
Exactly. So, sir, now coming to the kind of things that the countries are doing as a part of solution, generally we come to know this particular term COP. So, can you briefly elaborate like what this term is all about?
So, COP or Conference of Parties, Vishal, if let's say a treaty is signed, it's a multilateral treaty. So, those who have signed it or depending on the requirements of the treaty ratified it, meaning have completed all the formal process, are referred to as parties to the treaty. And conference of parties then becomes the meeting of those who have become part of that
Okay.
treaty.
Okay.
Now, the COPs also act as the highest decision making body of, let's say in this case, what we are talking about is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we see series of COPs. For example, famous COPs have been at Kyoto, which was the third conference of parties
Right.
of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the most recent one, COP29 at Baku. So what is happening? Those who are part of this treaty are meeting to decide the priorities or commitments. Now, apart from this, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has certain agreements inbuilt through these negotiations. So, for example, the outcome of the Kyoto COP was the Kyoto Protocol, which in itself is an agreement. And then the outcome of COP21 in 2015 at Paris is the Paris Climate Accord, which in itself is an agreement. So COPs also act as the meeting platform
Right.
for those who are parties to these kinds of protocols as well.
Right, sir. So, sir, now can we briefly talk about how they evolved? Because there were instances in the past that we had seen the countries were not giving that much regard to the climate, as you have already talked about in the introduction. And after this, since 1992, as you have talked about, there has been emergence of something like COP. So, what was the basically need for COP, and how the evolution of this particular thing took place?
When we are talking about environmental issues or an issue like climate change, Vishal, there are two ways of understanding it, and there can be multiple ways. But one is the science of it, and another is the decision making involved or policies of it or the politics of it. So we in this video are more concerned with the politics of it from international relations perspective. So the starting point is the evidence of science.
Right.
Environment as an issue was not an area of priority in international relations traditionally. Now, the recognition that environment itself would have an impact on outcomes, let's say, about the well-being of human beings or citizens of countries, came about in the late 1980s
Okay.
through, if we can identify a milestone, the creation of what is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was established under the umbrella of the UN with partnership between UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and World Meteorological Organization. So what IPCC does is it provides knowledge to governments, shares knowledge with government on the state of research on climate change. So this is coalition of scientific research. Some people would say that this is the biggest peer review of its kind that exists. Now, when the knowledge is there, the second step is the acknowledgement that something like climate change is an issue. So the IPCC reports made one thing clear, that though climate may change over long spans of time as a natural phenomenon, but what is happening in recent years, last 200-300 years, is that there is an anthropogenic factor, meaning there is a human contribution to the pace of climate change.
Exactly.
And this was primarily seen through how the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have increased, and how this increase of concentration of greenhouse gases is leading to changes in the climate system, which may have far reaching implications. Now, once the process is undertaken by the United Nations, this becomes an issue on which there is a lot of deliberation.
Right.
So there are countries in which there are environmental movements which are talking about it, non-governmental organizations, advocacy groups are talking about it. But then the first step towards a formal recognition of this issue at the level of national policies, national government, was the Rio Earth Conference of 1992. So what is it that the Rio Conference, Earth Conference did? So one is the acknowledgement that climate change is an issue to reckon with, and that is reflected in the treaty or the convention, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So acknowledgement that this is an issue that we need to deal with. Second, that the need for taking action is something that cannot be successful by the effort of one country. So there has to be a continuous process, right? So COP has to be understood as a part of a process more than an event in itself. Now, if you see the structure of the UNFCCC, in itself, it did not provide any concrete or binding commitments as to how to deal with climate change, but it opened up the path for negotiations that countries should sit and recognize. Now, the other thing is that there are certain things which still dictate the debate in this context. They have come from the original convention. So, for example, Article 3 of the convention says that countries should take action to arrest climate change on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So there is a recognition that everybody has a responsibility, but there is also a recognition that the concentration of greenhouse gases has increased because of industrial activities in the developed countries, and they have more resources and thereby more responsibility. All right, and they have more capability, so they should contribute more. So this is, as a principle, is established at first. Second is the idea that, this being the case, a uniformity of policy is not required, but what is required is a flexible approach. So this then is carried out through the first COP, because the UNFCCC comes into force in 1994, and 1995 is the first COP, which is at Berlin. And at Berlin, the idea is that we should be negotiating concrete outcomes, binding commitments. From the beginning, what is evident is that there are different views on these matters. So, for example, developed countries have their own perspective, developing countries have their own perspective. Now, how did the UNFCCC try to accommodate these differences? So, it has what are called annexes. It classifies countries in terms of annexes. So, Annex 1 countries are defined as industrialized countries and emerging economies, or emerging economic countries, and these countries have been given a greater responsibility. Then there are non-annexed countries, mainly low income and developing countries like India, and then there is the category of least developed countries, which need the most assistance. Now, this process leads to another milestone, which is binding commitments to deal with climate change. Now, how do you deal with climate change? So, these activities have been segregated into what is called mitigation, meaning you reduce the emission, reduce the quantity of greenhouse gases which are being emitted as part of economic activities, and then adaptation, that you adapt to any implications of climate change, present or visible in the future. So now, when the classification is done in this way, it creates a flexible ground for negotiation, and these negotiations have continued through COPs, and each COP is a reflection of the original priorities of the UNFCCC and the important elements of the debate which have been going on in the recent past.
So, sir, as you have comprehensively talked about how the COPs were evolved, and as an organization, UNFCCC, how it is playing a very important role, like in the form of convention. Now, sir, there has been a recent COP 29, that was held in Azerbaijan, Baku. So, sir, what are the major outcomes that emerged as a part of this particular COP? And is India in agreement with what all were discussed?
So this is a broad question. We need to break it down it into how have we reached to COP 29. So you see, if you can divide the whole COP process into two parts. One, you can say Kyoto period, and another you can say post Kyoto period. So Kyoto period, as I was mentioning as a response to the last question, was about the agreement reached through COP at Kyoto, which was the third COP, whereby the developed countries took upon themselves what are called the binding commitments. These are Annex 1 countries, to repeat again, and the commitment broadly was that they would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5% of the 1990 level. So 1990 was the defining date, and they had to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 5% from that particular level. Now, this itself, in order to come into action, took a lot of time. So subsequent COPs after Kyoto, which was in 1997, were about how do we exactly do this. So 1997 to 2005, it is the period in which it was agreed upon countries that developed countries would take on binding commitments. So first Kyoto commitment period is from 2005 to 2012. All right. Now let's go back to one step back and to the original convention itself. So the original convention says, as part of Article 4, that all countries in general should commit to combating climate change, contributing to climate change. But Article 4, Section 7 clearly says the extent to which developing countries would be able to meet their commitment depends on the extent to which developed countries meet their commitment on climate finance and technology transfer. So one was a straightforward issue. How do we take action? It was reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. But the second was how everybody should take action. So there should be adequate availability of finance and adequate availability of technology. Now these have been the basic issues which have been going on in the COPs. So if you see, by 2007, it was agreed that we need a stronger post-Kyoto agreement. And here what you see is developed and developing countries have a contention. Developed countries like US are saying that the cost imposed on developed countries is higher, wherein developing countries like India and China are also contributors to emissions of greenhouse gases. And developing countries like India would say that we are in a developing phase, so poverty alleviation is our priority and our socio-economic circumstances cannot be separated from climate goals. Now this is acknowledged within the UNFCCC. So what you see is that first bone of contention was binding commitments. Second bone of contention became how do we finance mitigation and adaptation. So after series of negotiations, 2009 at Copenhagen, it was agreed that developed countries would provide 100 billion a year for mitigation and adaptation purposes to developing countries, and this is how cooperation would move forward. So the Green Climate Fund of 100 billion US dollars through this process is created in 2013 by the time Durban COP happens. And then by 2015, we reach to the Paris Agreement. Now here what we are talking about is what would happen after 2020. Why? Because Kyoto Protocol was initially applied for a commitment period of 2008 to 2012. And then second commitment period became 2013 to 2020. So Kyoto was extended to 20. So what do we do after 2020? And we need to keep in mind differences between developed and developing countries, issues of finance and issues of technology, and the major emphasis being on mitigation and adaptation. So 2015, then we say that we have been able to adopt the most ambitious climate agreement so far, which is called the Paris Climate Accord. Now what is the goal of Paris Climate Accord? So one, through the series of IPCC reports, it was clear that there would be catastrophic impacts if the global temperature crosses 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in Paris, broadly countries could agree that they would make an effort to arrest the rise of global temperature below 2 degree. So 2 degree becomes the ceiling. How do we do it? So here now, different from Kyoto was that now everybody has to share the responsibility. But since there are differences in terms of developed countries, developing countries, small island, developing states, etc., you would see that flexibility still remains the major feature. So the targets, binding targets in concrete terms were not identified, they were left for negotiations, but it was clear that every country would announce its contribution, and this was in the form of nationally determined contribution, with the idea that by 2019 every country would submit its nationally determined contribution in terms of what it is going to do to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions or emission intensity of the economy and other measures for adaptation. So this was what was agreed at Paris. And then the issue of finance was still dissatisfactorily addressed as far as developing countries was concerned. For example, the 100 billion US dollars of promise was never met. By 2019 at best, we could reach 3 billion annually, that level. So it was dissatisfactory. So after 2015 COP21, series of COPs were about negotiating the rule book. How should we actually go about the major targets of COP at Paris or Paris Climate Accord? And then what you would see is that the COVID-19 period was a setback to this process, where the next COP was postponed, and the 26th COP then takes place at Glasgow. So what was agreed at Glasgow? At Glasgow, what was agreed was steps like the parties agreed that there should be a reduction of subsidies to fossil fuels. So a debate on specific fuels and should they be used, should they be stopped altogether starts, right? The next COP, which is the COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, what happens? So this idea that apart from adaptation and mitigation, what is required is providing country compensation for what is called loss and damage. Now, this is an idea that goes back to 2013 itself, where a set of countries had started talking about loss and damage. So, loss and damage fund in principle was agreed at the COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was COP 27. COP 28 is the COP at Dubai in UAE, where it was agreed that, for example, for the first time, fossil fuels should be phased down. And it was also agreed that the methane emissions should be capped by 2030 and renewable energy capacity should be increased. Now, you see, what is happening is that there is a general tone of negotiation which is going on, and specific goals and mechanisms are added through different COPs. So, not all COPs have been remarkable in that context, but certainly what is important is looking at the debate over last 2-3 COPs and coming to this COP. So, coming to COP 29, which was at Baku in 2024. The major outcome here has been A, if you go by the most observers, they would say the most important elements of Paris Agreement now have been negotiated. How do we implement Paris Agreement? Have been negotiated. For example, mostly people would say Article 7, which is about adaptation ambitions. So negotiations on them have been substantially completed, and Baku contributed to highlighting efforts towards adaptation. Article 6 has also been substantially completed through this particular COP 29. The important element of that is the new model for international carbon trade or carbon credit trade. So we are moving in that particular direction. Okay. And the third thing in terms of finance is the understanding reached on the new cumulative quantitative goal on climate finance. Now, this was also agreed at Paris that we should think about financing. So here, for example, a very, very loose, non-committal announcement has been made that a quantum of 1.3 trillion US dollars per year of financing would be mobilized to deal with climate change overall through various sources, public, private, multilateral, bilateral sources. So this new cumulative quantitative funding target is the highlight, but what actually would come out of it is yet to be negotiated through the COP, next COP, which would be in Brazil, 2030. Okay. So if we see A, we can say that on all elements of the Paris Climate Accord, negotiations have happened by now. B, on new funding requirements, new funding mechanism, there has been an understanding which has been reached. Now, so for example, it takes forward the 100 billion commitment which was reached in 2009. So the ambition at least has increased to 1.3 trillion by 2035. But there is a lack of clarity on this, right? And there is a certain disappointment in, let's say, small island developing states on this matter. And developing countries like India are also not happy because they were pitching for a concrete commitment to 1.3 trillion annually. What they got was a loose commitment to make an effort towards 1.3 trillion annually, right? And out of this 1.3 trillion, what developing countries would get is around 300 billion of climate financing annually. So these can be seen as major outcomes this time round.
Right. So, sir, I think what you have said that India is not in agreement with whatever was discussed or whatever was the major outcome of this particular summit. So can you briefly highlight like what were the major points of disagreement that India has with respect to the outcomes?
So that's why, Vishal, I had spelled out that if you look at United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's a very broad agreement with the parameters of debate discussed. And it also acknowledges the diversity of the world, right? So the differences as there are because India is a developing country and it is now taking on commitment. So it had submitted its revised NDCs to the UN in 2022, whereby it has an ambition of becoming carbon neutral by 2070. It has ambitious renewable energy goals and afforestation goals. So what India is saying is that, look, we are willing to take responsibility, but given our stage of growth and our economic imperative, we need support in terms of technology and finance. So one, along with G77, China and group of like-minded developing countries, India is also very critical of the lack of concrete commitment on 1.3 trillion to be provided annually in climate finance. Second is how clandestinely or indirectly some of the developed partners, like partners in the EU, are transferring the cost to developing countries in the form of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, all right, wherein they would be taxing the imports to EU market on the basis of emission in the producing country. So India does not agree with this also. India believes that it is violation of CBDR. So as of now, the theme continues that India is not satisfied with the kind of commitment that developed countries are making, and in return the kind of commitment they want countries like India to take. India highlighted how, despite its limitation, what it is contributing is significant. So it shows that it is willing to take its own share of responsibility. But India is also cognizant of the fact that as climate change negotiation becomes more complex, what would happen is a concern for cost cutting, which is seen in terms of CBAM. So India is highlighting the principle of equity, principle of just climate transition, and also holding on to the principle of CBDR, where flexibilities have to be there.
Okay, so sir, now my last question to you is when we have discussed regarding this much conflicts and the countries are not on the same page with respect to what should be adopted for a way forward. So going ahead, like what should be the nature of such kind of agreement and what do you see like the future of this kind of COP as well as the UNFCCC?
So here what we have to see is now we have to take a step back and we see that from the beginning, nobody was completely happy with the outcomes of the COP process. So you see, initially the US was opposing any kind of binding commitments. From the first COP onwards, US withdrew from the Kyoto, US under Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord, all right? And countries like India and the developing country group are continuously arguing that there are two things which are required. Finance should be made available and technology should be transferred so that countries like India can also better contribute to combating climate change, which is causing change in the climate system. So this theme continues broadly and this would continue. But the second thing that we should understand is that a world without rules is worse than a world with imperfect rules. So the rules have been laid down and the process of building these rules continues, right? So patience would be required on the part of everyone and a lot of bilateral cooperation. The more the understanding between, let's say, India and European Union, India and US improves on this matter, it would also translate into collective action through the COP. So to expect that at the COP process there would be any quick progress would be ignorance of the history of the COP process itself. It is going to be a slow process, but then the focus has to be on meaningful financing, meaningful transfer of technology. Secondly, what we should see is that in these contexts, if we simply think in terms of states, it would not be enough. So what are the experts saying regarding or despite everything that goes on, Some people declare it as a success, some people declare it as a failure. But experts are of the opinion that the ambition of 2 degree Celsius rise is too small an ambition, right? The ambition should be 1.5 degree or less. So this is the scientific opinion. So the next thing that is required is, how do states as conference of parties come closer to the actual scientific understanding? So the next thing that we should be looking at, Vishal, at the COP 2030 is, what do countries decide to do with the outcomes of global stock taking, right? So this was one of the failures of COP 29, that the first global stock taking came out in 2023, which is warning at catastrophic implications of climate change and how the current efforts are not cutting the requirement, and we need to be more ambitious. So rather than deciding on how to deal with the outcomes of global stock take, it has been postponed to the next COP. So the third thing that we should be thinking in terms of is, now we have the numbers through the measurement of emissions or calculation of commitments by countries. So we should be able to make more concrete goals, right? The goals of the countries and the goals of the scientific community, scientific knowledge. There is a gap there. We need to bridge that gap. And in that, the young educated audience who are listening to this, or the students in the classes, or those who are in universities, they have a larger role to play, because they would be the next generation of policymakers.
Exactly. So, sir, thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us regarding what kind of issues that we are facing with respect to climate. And not only it is an environmental issues, it is going to have a lot of implication, as we had discussed, on the bilateral relations between countries, because the resources are limited, and the way the countries are utilizing these resources, it is going to create certain kind of conflicts, and these issues might further exacerbate in the form of certain new conflicts that we may see in the future.
Very well put, Vishal.
So thank you very much, sir, again.
Thanks a lot.
With this, we came to an end to this particular conversational video regarding climate change. As sir has already put in the context that climate change is a very important and the crucial issues as far as the international relations are concerned. So just make sure that whatever we are doing in our daily life, how we are putting certain kind of carbon footprint, we should also be having certain kind of idea about it. So with this, we are concluding this particular video. For more such educational content, stay tuned with Vision IAS. Thank you.